that we're able to study history, to understand it from the perspective of thy word. And we know that with thy guidance and thy help that we'll be able to understand what has happened so that we can better understand what's happening now and what is to come. I pray that thou wouldst be with us tonight, strengthen our faith, help us, O Lord, to gain all the information that we possibly can. Speak to our hearts, O Lord, and help us in that which we do this night. We do it to thy glory, to the glory of thy kingdom. Let every hindering spirit be put to flight and made powerless in the presence of thy saving name and of thy blood by which we are saved. I ask this all now in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, praise the Lord. Now, last time we spent a good deal of time talking about the early days of our country. Who remembers how many colonies there were? That should be real easy. How many colonies were there? Samuel? 13 colonies. And what was the southernmost colony? The one farthest to the south. Remember, it's a thin strip of land, really. Well, relatively thin when you consider how wide the whole nation is. But all the way up the coast. What was the southernmost colony of the 13? Who remembers? Okay, nobody remembers. All right, it was Georgia. Georgia was the farthest to the south. What would be the northernmost? Remember, there was no Vermont yet. Okay. New Hampshire. New Hampshire was farthest to the north. Okay, and then you had little colonies in here. Who thinks they know what the smallest one would be? And it's still the smallest state in the Union. I drove all the way through it. In fact, these states are so small out here that when we about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, we were out in New Haven, Connecticut, right there. I drove through the better part of 3 states in one afternoon. The smallest one is one of them I drove through diagonally yet, and that was Rhode Island, right here. Because we were heading up toward Boston, actually Rockland, right up in here. So we flew into New Haven, from Wisconsin to New Haven, well, first to Chicago, and then over here, and then we drove from here up through around Providence, Rhode Island, and up to Rockland near Plymouth and Boston. Okay, didn't take that long, really. I think we got in about 1 o'clock, and we got there, but it took about 4 hours to go through the better part of 3 states. So it sounds like you're really flying, but they're very small. Anyway, you had 13 colonies, and we talked about the Revolutionary War. I'm going to just review you just a little bit to see how much you remember. Okay? We said that the Bible talks about this nation, at least from what we can tell, certainly tells us of the religious influence, the evil influence that came in. We talked, of course, about a certain evangelist, George Whitefield, who went all the way from Georgia to Maine and preached in every one of those 13 colonies. He spent his whole life preaching. Incidentally, I just want to tell you this about George Whitefield. I meant to do this last week. Before I ask you any more questions, I'd like to just mention something. George Whitefield went to Oxford, and he went through a religious training program. And he also, he was a roommate with John Wesley and another young man, and they became preachers. But Wesley came from a very wealthy family, and so did the other man. So the way that Whitefield got through school is he became their servant. They put 3 in a room, and usually one poor boy would be in there, and he would carry the books and clean and wash the clothes for the other ones, and that's how he'd earn his way through school. A very humble way to do it, and that was George Whitefield. George Whitefield, of course, listened to all the teaching and all the training, but he came to the realization one day that you're justified by faith, and you can't work your way into heaven, but you are justified by faith in the Lord, that it's the blood of Jesus that paid the price for us. And that changed his whole direction around. But he was a very powerful preacher. He would go out into the poorest areas and he'd preach. One of the areas in England, because that's where he was at the beginning, one of the areas he preached was among the coal miners. And he would tell how they would come out of the ground, out of these caves by the hundreds, all covered with black coal dust from mining, to listen to him preach. And he'd tell a story how they get down on their knees and begin to weep under the presence of God, and the tears would run down, and there'd be streaks down their face. Their faces were all black, and the tears would wash their coal dust away as if to wash the sin away, and he'd tell those stories, how that was. And as a matter of fact, John Wesley came along later, and Whitefield said, I need to go to America, so I want you to take over and keep preaching to these people. So Wesley took up big collections from the people and then took off with the money. Most people don't realize that. Just forsook the whole bunch. Did you know that? Have you ever heard that about Wesley? Wesley took over where Whitefield left off among the coal miners, and took up collections from them. They were going to put up a church structure and get established, and Wesley was organizing all this because Whitefield had turned it over to him. And then when Wesley had got enough money together, he just forsook all the people and left, took the money with him. That's awful, isn't it? Of course, you don't hear much about Whitefield at all, but you hear everything about Wesley. What a great and wonderful, build the Methodist church, and he did all these things. Anyway, what happened with George Whitefield is the way he got to America is he basically boarded a ship with some very rough characters. He wanted to come over here and preach. He felt like God was calling him over here. And these sailors were just terrible. They were rank heathen sinners. And he got on this ship, and nobody wanted to hear. He tried to preach a little bit, and they just basically shut him up. We don't want to hear anything that you've got to say. They said, if you're going to be on this ship, we're going to throw you overboard unless you just shut up. But he wasn't one to shut up. He started talking to just a few of the men at a time. He said, you sailors don't know how to read, do you? And they said, no, of course not. We never went to school. He said, would you like me? This is going to take a while to get over there. It generally took anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the wind and so forth. And he said, I'll teach you to read. Well, there's only one book that they had, and that was the one that Whitefield had with him. That was the Bible. So he sat down with these soon after he started. The class kept getting bigger and bigger, and he was teaching them to read out of the Bible. Well, it wasn't long until the words started to take effect on these sailors. And it wasn't but a few weeks out, and he was preaching to them. He'd get up on deck, and he'd be preaching away, and before long he had everybody on the ship converted. They had all had quite an experience with the Lord, including the captain. In fact, the captain retired from service and gave his ship to Whitefield and took him all over the place, up the coast and all over. And the captain said, I'm just going to donate my life to the Lord and my sailing ability, and I'm going to work with you and take you wherever you want to go. And they said that there were various times when Whitefield would be preaching and other ships would come in and they'd hear him from a distance. He had a powerful, powerful voice. They would actually attach several ships together so that they wouldn't drift away, and then he would get up there and he'd preach to shiploads of people. So not only in the land, but also out in the coastal waters. So it was quite a dynamic thing, and he actually was the one who brought, you might say, true religion to the colonists. Because these colonists basically wanted to get away not only from the Roman Catholic Church, they wanted to get away from everything. And most of the people that came over here, they tell us we're seeking religious freedom. Now, there was a minority that did that. The majority came over for land, to build plantations, to try to make money and set up a new life, to get away from English taxes and so forth. Ruth? I don't know all of Whitefield's doctrine. Basically, what he did is he spent his whole life just preaching against sin and yielding to God, and then he just let the Lord take over from there. Basically, he preached repentance. But as far as all of the little other doctrines that, were in churches and so forth, I really couldn't say. But his main concern was he saw sin, he saw evil, and he preached against sin and got people to a place of repentance. And he figured that if I can get them to a place of repentance, the Lord will take over their heart. and he will do what he will with those people. That was his feeling. So up and down the colonies he went. Now, we also talked about the Revolutionary War and the things that led up to it. England began to impose taxes. They began to force the colonists to house their soldiers at no charge. In other words, the soldier could come to your house and say, I'm living with you. You had to feed them. You had to give them a room. The colonists didn't like that. That was one of the things they really objected to. In fact, did you know it's in our Constitution that cannot be done? It's unconstitutional. See, all the things that they were mad at Britain about, you will actually find in our Constitution. In fact, if you really read the Constitution, it will tell you that the Constitution isn't to give government power. It's to limit government. That's why it was drawn up. They had had enough of big government. So they wanted to limit it, and if you really read the Constitution all the way through, it's basically the government telling the government, you can't do this, and 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 you can't do this. There's even one of the amendments, I don't recall the number exactly, but it basically says, and if we left anything out, you can't do that either. So they were covering everything. It was a great limitation on the government. Okay? Any comments or questions? So, the Revolutionary War was fought north and south. Remember, there was a line that was drawn by two men. They were astronomers from England. They were Freemasons. Do you remember what that line is called? Oh, this is easy. What was that line called? The Mason-Dixon line. You've heard of Dixie. That's the South, isn't it? The Mason-Dixon line ran all the way from, well, basically it cut off Virginia from Pennsylvania. That was the original. Then it later expanded out around the Ohio River. Cincinnati is right on the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, and it just kept moving. As the country grew, it just kept moving and moving. And basically it just fizzled out somewhere out by Illinois. But so they just consider it this first part of the country was the Mason-Dixon line. But it separated the country into two nations. There was northern United States, or northern colonies, and southern colonies. To this day, there is still kind of a dividing line. You know what I mean? There's north and there's south. And if you go south and you're from the north and you're not one of the good old boys, you really don't fit in to this very day. They're still fighting the Civil War down here. And, there's some real pride in the South. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that 1 out of every 4 men was a lodge member. The Masonic Lodge was far more prominent in the South than it was in the North. And Charleston, South Carolina was the headquarters for the Southern jurisdiction. Who remembers where the Northern jurisdiction headquarters was? St. Andrew's Lodge in what city? It's a real prominent city in Massachusetts. Boston. And who took care of who actually dressed up like Indians in the Boston Tea Party? The Masons. It's right in their minutes of their meeting. We will now adjourn for tea. So they did in Boston Harbor. But there's a lot of masonry. To this day, masonry is very, very heavy in the South. There's a lot of it up here, but far more in the South than there's in the North. Okay, Ruth? Well, there were 2 different cultures entirely. And there still is that social dividing line. It never has really changed. There are 2 different kinds of people that developed there. And probably the proudest state is Texas. The Texans seem to have a pride kind of installed into their being. If you ever get talking to them, I told a Texas minister one time, he got really, really mad at me. I told him what General Sheridan said. General Sheridan, of course, was one of the northern generals in the Civil War. General Sheridan made the statement one time. He said, if I owned Texas and hell, he said, I'd rent out Texas and live in hell. Now that was That was his way of saying, I don't like Texas. He didn't like hell either, but he preferred that to Texas, see. And this minister just blew up. He said, I wonder if he feels the same way now. You know, like anybody who didn't like Texas must be in hell today. That's got to be a criteria for salvation, you know. So if you don't like Texas, you go to hell, you know. But anyway, there's a lot of pride down there. But in these colonies, they fought the Revolutionary War. We had General John Burgoyne, who came from the northern area, moving south. He kind of hung around New York quite a bit. In fact, his major campaign was when he went down the Hudson River, Fort Edward, Fort Ticonderoga. Remember, he left 1,000 men behind there. He was also known as the bridge building general. He built 40 bridges along the river and various streams on his way down. But he camped near Saratoga Springs. Remember that? And Horatio Gates, another general, had just happened to make camp 4 miles from there. So Burgoyne had 7,000 men, and Gates had 12,000, and then Gates called up the Minutemen and ended up with 20,000 and heavy artillery. So Burgoyne was defeated at Saratoga, and a major portion of the British Army was beaten near Saratoga Springs, New York. Down to the south, there was Cornwallis. General, he was a cavalier among the British. He was a high-ranking, they call him Lord Cornwallis because he had that title. He was awarded various degrees of heraldry in England. But anyway, he was working down more into Virginia and the southern colonies here. North Carolina, many battles were fought. South Carolina by Cornwallis. In the south, there was a man by the name of Francis Marion, South Carolina, way down in here, and to this day, he's a wonderful hero. We were just down in South Carolina, and we went through the town of Marion, which is named for him, and they had this big sign up, Francis Marion outfoxed the British. They're still fighting that war down there, too. They called him the Swamp Fox because he grew up in a swampy area in South Carolina, Berkeley County to be exact. He fought many battles with the Cherokee, and he fought the British on the side of the French. Remember, there was a French and Indian war, too. And the French and the Indians, the French gave the Indians tobacco, and they bought their tobacco, rather, and gave them liquor for their tobacco, and they traded back and forth and got the Indians drunk, and they loved the French, because the French were just pigs, you know. They'd give them liquor and get them all liquored up, and of course the Indians loved that firewater. They had never had it before. That came over from the cultured people in England, see. They are the alcoholics. But anyway, so they had quite a rapport with the French, and so the French and Indians fought against the British over land and different areas, and there were battles fought way over as far as Detroit and way up even into Minnesota. Fort Snelling over here and Fort Detroit. There were a whole bunch of French forts that actually fell to the British. So there was exploring going on. Not a lot of it, but they would travel the waterways basically and stay along those. Anyway, Francis Marion became known as a Swamp Fox because he had the most unusual technique of fighting. In those days, an army would face an army. You would have the vanguard up in front leading the way, and then you would have the whole regiment coming behind it, and you would just line up, and you'd take your muskets and point them. Everybody point their muskets at each other and start shooting. And muskets were very, very inaccurate. They were way off. You just happened to hit somebody. It was just chance is all it was. Because generally you could be 18 inches off your mark. They were just... See, a rifle is the ammunition that's in a rifle. The bullet actually spins, and it keeps it straight. Whereas with a musket, you stuck a ball of lead in there. First you poured powder in, put a ball of lead in, you ram it down, you put some wadding in there, usually a little paper or whatever, and that would hold the ball in place against the powder. and you'd shoot and this ball would just go shooting out and it would go who knows where. Maybe hit your target, maybe not. So every gun was different. Anyway, what they do is line up and they just shoot at each other until somebody killed more than the other, and whoever happened to win would win. One would finally surrender. That's the way they fought. Francis Marion was a guerrilla fighter. That doesn't mean he fought big monkeys. It means he had a different technique of warfare. He would strike fiercely with the band of men that he had and then vanish. He wouldn't stay and fight. He'd come in, they'd have a shoot him up, and suddenly they'd look around, and where is he? He'd disappear, like the Indians did. And he might be up in the trees somewhere or in the middle of the swamp. They'd never find him. They call him the swamp fox. So he was out there. It was a game with him, killing British. He loved killing British. And he'd just come out, and he'd kill a whole bunch of them before breakfast and go and eat, and he'd go back and get some more and disappear. That's the way he was. And they just hated him for it, as you can well imagine. He fought a battle at Hanging Rock, 96, Rocky Mountain, Parker's Ferry. He fought at, Cornwallis was fighting Francis Marion and other forces. They fought at Kings Mountain, right near Charlotte. And to the south, there was another little place called Cowpens, and the colonists were winning in all of these. As this war progressed, it finally came to a head in Virginia. That's where the Revolutionary War ended. You had 3 battles before Yorktown. Cornwallis won them, too. He won all 3 of them. In fact, Cornwallis only had 2,000 men left, and Washington kept getting beaten. Lafayette, Gates, Greene, Washington were beaten all the time toward the end of the war. Cornwallis said, why don't you just surrender? But they never did. They kept fighting. Washington really stirred up his men because he stood to lose all of his land, and that's what he really cared about. Petersburg, Fredericksburg, and Charlottesville in Virginia. And finally, he went to Yorktown. At Yorktown, Washington was able to gain the help of Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau, a French general. And with the help of the French general at Yorktown, the war ended. In what year? What year did Cornwallis surrender his army? The actual surrender took place in 1782. Okay. When the war ended, of course, the British vacated. The 13 colonies were intact. It was not long until expansion began to set in. Try and guess. Now, we had 13 colonies. Try and guess what states were added next. Now, it went from 13 to 17 very, very quickly. Can anybody tell me one of the states they think was added of those that made the 17? The other 4. Yeah, Ohio came in real quick, but there was one came in before that. Daniel Boone had a whole lot to do with it. Kentucky. Kentucky came in, and what else do you think? Tennessee. Yeah. So the expansion was more toward the south. Now there's a reason for that. Because Louisiana territory was owned by the French. The French were allies with the colonies, you've got to remember. So you go from Louisiana, there's a big triangle, goes all the way up like this, and way up like this, a huge mass of land owned by the French. The French sold that land to the United States for $15 million. Can you imagine? $15 million for a great big midsection of the whole country. It was called the Louisiana Purchase. The states began to expand, and something else happened, though, that I want to mention. In the textbooks, they always mention this, but they don't tell you the reason for it. There was another war with Britain not long after the Revolutionary War. Do you remember what that war was called? Have you ever read about it? The War of 1812. And the excuse for that war is that the colonies, I should call it America now, I'll just call it America, the United States, complained that British ships were stopping American ships which were trading in northern Africa and in southern Europe and so forth. There, we had a fleet, a merchant fleet at that time, a small one. But the British were very powerful on the water, and they were stopping American ships and forcing sailors to come and serve on their ships. That was the excuse given for it. That's not really the reason for the War of 1812. And you have to look high and low to find the reason, but it's out there. The real reason for it is there was a banking element in Europe at this time. In fact, the Rothschild banking dynasty was going great guns in Europe. They controlled all the money of all of Europe. They were trying to force President James Madison to set up a central bank over here because the United States was growing. Remember, I forgot to mention this too, and that is that every nation needs a money, a currency of some kind, a standard of a way of measuring money. Congress specified in advance the only lawful money the country could have was gold and silver coin. Paper money was absolutely illegal. Still is under the Constitution. Did you know that? That's never changed. Paper money is illegal in the United States. Constitutionally. As a matter of fact, the first Federal Reserve bills that came out, I have some. I should have thought to bring one. And Brother Mick, you might remember what it said on there. That this currency is redeemable for lawful money at any United States Treasury. Did you ever see one of those bills? There's a big disclaimer, a caveat on there. It's in the upper left. There's 3 or 4 sentences telling that this can be redeemed for lawful money. Okay? Because the Constitution says gold and silver coin and absolutely nothing else. But that began to change. The government printed what they called continental money during the Revolutionary War and just after, and they paid the soldiers with it, and it was worthless. They didn't have anything to back it up with, and so there was an old saying in those days, it ain't worth a continental. Anything that was no good. If you had a gun that didn't fire, they say it ain't worth a continental, meaning the money. So what was happening is they had to form some kind of a money system, and little banks popped up all over the place. Anybody could really start one. You could start a bank if you could get people to trust you with your gold and silver coin. People began to issue paper on gold and silver. It wasn't really lawful money, but it was a note that said there is lawful money in the vault, and you can have it with this piece of paper. So banks began to spring up. What Rothschild wanted to do is force President Madison to set up a central bank, a Federal Reserve Bank, so to speak. Madison flatly refused. As a result, the War of 1812 broke out. It was over banking. It wasn't over stealing sailors and putting them on ships. That was happening, but that wasn't the real reason for the war. Just like in the Civil War, which we'll talk about later, the real reason for the Civil War was not slavery. The real issue was states' rights. That's why the South seceded. As the country was growing, and then this war broke out, it didn't last long. It actually really kind of dragged on a little while, though, until a certain general down in New Orleans beat the British and drove them out. Does anyone think they know what year that might be? The Battle of New Orleans? 1814. Okay? That officially ended it. But during this war, something else happened. The British did come in. They did attack Washington in the District of Columbia, which is right there. Okay? See, what they did when they set up the nation's capital, they marked off a certain plot of land that's actually kind of diamond-shaped, like a sideways square, and that was called D.C., or District of Columbia. It wasn't really a state. It was its own separate little thing, just like the Vatican City is its own. The Vatican City is its own country, really. Okay, it isn't part of Italy, is what I'm saying. It isn't even part of Rome. All right? So, they set up their own little District of Columbia here, and what happened is the British attacked Washington and they burned the Capitol. Now, the president's wife, Dolly Madison, managed to save a lot of the documents and papers and things. She's credited with having saved our heritage, really, by getting all these documents and things out before the Capitol was burned. But it was destroyed, and then from there they proceeded to go to Baltimore. They were going to destroy Baltimore. Now, Baltimore had a fort, Fort McHenry. You know where I'm going with this now? Fort McHenry was under attack by the British, and that is where the national anthem was written, near Fort McHenry, on a ship, a British ship, because a man named Francis Scott Key was held prisoner on this British ship. He was detained, put it that way. They said they were detaining him. He wasn't really a prisoner, but he was detained. So you might say he was a prisoner, however you want to look at it. So, anyway, as the story goes, it looked like Baltimore would fall because Washington fell. But all night long, the Fort McHenry was pummeled and attacked and so forth, and artillery. And early in the morning, he saw that the flag was still flying, the colonial flag of America. And so then he was so inspired that he wrote the song, The Star-Spangled Banner, which was later made the national anthem. Would anyone like to guess what year the Star-Spangled Banner was made the national anthem by law? I'm just curious to see what you think. It was in the 1900s, that's correct. It was during the Roosevelt administration. 1931. 1931. Anyway, but the song was out there for a long, long time. When that War of 1812 ended, of course, the British were beaten off again. Now the colonies, the United States of America, as it began to expand, needed money. Did I stress that point before? And that's why Rothschild had an edge on Madison. He said, look, Europe will finance you, but only through a central bank. Otherwise, you get nothing. That was the Rothschilds. See, a lot of the money had to come from abroad. Otherwise, there'd be no expansion. But the country began to grow. They beat off the British. Andrew Jackson actually finalized the thing as far as totally rejecting the Rothschild plan. Andrew Jackson was a war hero that beat the British off in New Orleans. Later on became president. Now, the country, without the help of the Rothschilds, began to expand, began to move westward. You had two men named Lewis and Clark. You've probably heard of them. Their expeditions west. Okay, Shelley? The Rothschilds were running basically everything. The reason for that is because, basically England ran Europe. And the French, the Austrians, all of the important countries in Europe had a Rothschild relative running its banking system. It was quite a network. They had gained a great deal of power by dealing with different princes and kings in Europe. And through a lot of shenanigans and a lot of shady deals, they were making money for them. At least it looked that way. They were using actually one prince's money to, let's put it this way, they got several princes or kings to invest in their little banking system, and then they would go and show one the whole big bundle of money and say, look what I made for you, when it really wasn't all theirs, it was everybody else's too. See? And then they began to be a very trusted, solid banking house, and everybody wanted to do business with them. In the meantime, they pulled some very shady deals. So that's how the Rothschilds became so powerful. But the way England came to prominence with the Rothschild system is that Rothschild set up a lie. I guess you just have to say it was a ruse. What happened is, I think I'd mentioned this before, didn't I? About the courier that came riding in saying Wellington lost at Waterloo, and Rothschild had hired him to do it. He was a good actor. and everybody sold their stocks on Fleet Street, which is our equivalent of their equivalent to Wall Street. And Rothschild turned around and bought everything up, and he bought England in one afternoon. He bought the whole country. He owned it. So he had a lot of control. So they were in power, yes. And he was wanting to control this big new country across the sea. They've always wanted that. And they got it, too, because they control it financially to this day. So the expansion went westward. States were added. In fact, by the mid-1800s, quite a number of states were added. Even this one that we're living in right now, called Wisconsin, was added. I think in, 1848, right? Wisconsin was added in. So the nation was really growing. Everything was moving westward. Something else began to take place. Now I want to bring some scripture into this in a few minutes because something started to happen. We're going to be talking about the Civil War, which was a real turning point in the nation. The nation grew, spread westward, but then came to a grinding halt until the Civil War was over. When the Civil War was over, the whole world changed. Everything changed. Is anybody going to ask me, what do you mean? How did everything change? There was never a time in all of history, now we're talking thousands of years, there was never a time in all of that span of time like there was just after the Civil War. Inventions started coming forth, one after another, after another, after another, after another. For thousands and thousands of years, the world was always the same. People rode around on horses. The weapons gradually evolved. Gunpowder was discovered and stuff. But everything was moving slowly and pretty much staying the same. After the Civil War, telegraph, or actually before the Civil War, telegraph was invented. It was used during the Civil War. Not long after that, as you move into closer to 1900, but still in the 1800s, a man named Edison, a Scottish man named Alexander Graham Bell, and others began to invent things that were like miracles. It's like the world had suddenly come awake, and everything was being discovered. It was really an amazing time. There had never been anything like it. We'll talk about some of the great inventors, too, as we get into the 20th century, even the 19th century. But first of all, I think what we have to do is deal with this country that was expanding so rapidly. All this land was added in. The government was becoming more and more powerful centrally. But yet the nation was divided on a number of issues. In the South, and southern states were added here. Texas, of course, was its own, well, actually, Texas was its own nation for a while. What is the slogan of Texas, the state motto? What is it called? And what's its emblem? The Lone Star State, exactly. It's a five-pointed star, isn't it? Texas is a massive piece of land, isn't it? Did you realize, or do you realize, that Texas is not really a part of the United States of America like the other states are? I'm just going to give you a little something you won't get in the textbooks or in the university, because they don't tell this very much. Very few people know this. Texas has to vote every year. It's the only state there is that does it. Texas votes every year to stay in the Union. If they don't vote, they're out. And if they don't vote to stay in, they become their own nation. Isn't that interesting? The Lone Star State. Because they're in the country by charter. And that charter is renewed every year. Still is. I never knew that till Dr. Crane had mentioned that, Stuart Crane. And a while back, and I know I'm jumping the gun here, but a while back, there was a very wealthy oil family, the Hunt family. And they were buying up, they lived in Texas, they're buying up silver. The silver prices skyrocketed. They were buying all the silver they could get because they, along with another man named John Connolly, who happened to be sitting with Kennedy in his car when he was shot. Connally was the governor of Texas at the time. The plan was, kind of interesting, isn't it? It failed, of course. But they had a plan that they were going to do that, and they were going to break the back of the Federal Reserve. And they're going to have their own nation. Today, the Hunt family, which was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, is bankrupt. They went through bankruptcy proceedings. They pulled the plug on them. How did they do it? The rest of the nation lowered the price of silver, and they just hedged them in so much that they lost everything. They had to take everything at a loss. They had to sell off their assets, and they put them out. Connally was shot sitting next to Kennedy, but he survived. And later he gave in to the government, and basically, of course, he became the Secretary of the Treasury for a while. Anyway, it's quite a story, but that comes later. But the states to the south were always preaching the doctrine of states' rights. The states to the south had slaves. You have to understand that, if you read a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, if you read a book like that, you hate everybody in the South. They're all Simon Legrees. They're all beating and whipping their blacks and calling them niggers and kicking them around and raping the women. And now, there were a few that did that. But the vast majority of the people in the South didn't do that. They treated their slaves very well. In fact, the slaves only had to work about 6 to 8 weeks out of the year, and they had the rest of the year off. And they went fishing, and they lived in their little cabins, and they strummed their banjos and just had a good time. They worked very hard for about 6 to 8 weeks when there was cotton picking time. When it was picking time, they worked. But otherwise, you got to remember, the average plantation in the South had 100 slaves. Now, they could not afford to pay 100 people to work on their plantation. The economy would not have allowed it. That's why when the South began to be hedged in by the North, saying you can't have slavery, it's immoral, they were saying then you're destroying our whole economy because we can't pay these people. We're already giving them food, room and board for all year for working 2 months. But in the North, you had all these firebrand people would get up and make all these anti-slavery abolitionist statements, and you had this heavy pressure against the South. The South was for states' rights, but the emotional issue, see, every war, every cause has to have an emotional issue as well as the real issue. Something to fan the flame, something to intensify the whole cause. So in the North, you had people, a lot of preachers got involved in it too. Slavery is this awful thing. They're beating them to death down there. They're breaking up families. There were a couple examples of it, but that was all. And they blamed the whole South for being awful. Simon Legree, whip-swinging, nigger-hating, they call it. They had all kinds of names for them. And that's just the way they dealt with it. There began to be an alienation between North and South. Okay? And the country was divided in half. This put progress really to a grinding halt. Now, everything moved this way to the west, but all of this was unclaimed, unsettled. It was just territorial. But there was one more state that existed at the time of the Civil War, a western state. Now, what state would that be? Okay, what state in the West existed as a state, not just a territory? All right, it was California. California, out here. And does anybody think they know why California became a state so quickly? Wouldn't it stand to reason? First, you'd have to have Wyoming and Utah, and they said, wouldn't you think they'd come first? Yeah. Up here near Sacramento, there was a man named Sutter. We say Sutter. But he was a Swiss man, and he had a mill out here near Sacramento, and he discovered gold. And everybody wanted a piece of the action. So a lot of people were moving west, and they stopped at Lafayette. Is Lafayette on here? Lafayette, Indiana, right here. Lafayette was a major zone for stocking up on supplies. And then they'd go to Independence, Missouri, was the next one. There's Independence. And after Independence, there wasn't anything. That was your last stop right there. And they went westward, and you had the wagon trains moving. And they settled California in what year was the gold rush? The 49, yeah, you heard of the 49ers. That's where they got their name. San Francisco 49ers, okay. So, in 1849, there was a massive gold rush, and California was settled. By the time of the Civil War, which broke out in 1861, it was a well-established state. And the head senator out there, the man who really ran the state, was a man named John Conness, who actually was in on the assassination of Lincoln. Later on, I'll tell you about the ones who really assassinated Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger, but he was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and so was everybody else in Lincoln's cabinet, with the exception of Seward. Yeah, the Knights of the Golden Circle was a Masonic order, a secret Masonic order within the lodge, and the Knights of the Golden Circle, after it became known that it was them, of course they never pinned that on the officials, but they did pin it on the Knights of the Golden Circle as a organization. So it disbanded, and then they went down here in Stone Mountain, Georgia, right near Atlanta. I don't know if my pointer is always ending up in the right spot. Stone Mountain is right, actually it's part of Atlanta, you might as well say. They formed a new organization called the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, because Ku Klux in Greek means Golden Circle. So really it's the same thing, Knights of the Golden Circle or Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. They are the ones that assassinated the president, and even the northern cabinet members were part of that same organization. Okay, Ruth? Well, yeah. What caused a lot of the people to hate blacks so much, and the hatred was mostly in the South. Now, when they came north, they were hated there too. But I'll tell you what happened. When Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was just before Gettysburg, right near the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, then there was a feeling among the blacks of, now this is our jubilee. We're all set free. Here's our great emancipator. Here's our great, benefactor here, Abraham Lincoln. And so they began to get, not right away, but when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, when the papers were signed, and the South was beaten and their money was worthless, and all people had was the land and whatever they could grow on it. The wealth of the South was wiped out. There was nothing left at all. The blacks basically took over. And they joined up with what were called the carpetbaggers and the scallywags, who would come in and just confiscate and just take whatever they could and steal whatever they could. And every one of them seemed to have a couple of blacks on their wagon as they'd come into a house or a plantation, and they'd just come in, and people hated the blacks. Yeah. Then they exploited the blacks. Yeah. They were basically, they're from the north, but they came, a lot of them were from Tennessee. Tennessee, during the war, broke away from the South and joined the Union, which is why Andrew Johnson from Tennessee Lincoln made him vice president during his second term in hopes that it would gain support from the South. He chose a man from Tennessee. Tennessee left the Confederacy prematurely before the war was over. Okay? Yeah, the South was beaten down. So you got to remember that the Civil War was supposed to be over in 90 days. I guess we can move on to the Civil War for a few minutes here. Because basically what we're dealing with is, we could cover a lot of details of growth, but it's basically the same sort of a thing. Settlers went west gradually, states were added, if you kind of get the picture. Lewis and Clark went out yonder and with a guide named Sacagawea, okay, Indian guide. And a lot of things happened, but nothing of major significance except plain old expansion. Now, we weren't in the era of great inventions yet. That came after the Civil War. As I said, once the Civil War ended, then the whole world changed, because it was one invention after another, and they were remarkable, amazing things that happened. I can't wait to get into that, because I think I'll show you a few scriptures that seem to indicate that period of time that came forth, and then, well, we're still in it. We're in the computer age now. You think about that for a minute. Up until 1900, the world was pretty much like it was. Kerosene lamps, gas lamps were the newest thing, actually. But all of a sudden, within a few years, you had automobiles and typewriters, sewing machines. All this stuff seemed to come from nowhere. A phonograph, electricity was quite something when that was, generators were built and so forth. Okay? So, everything changed. But before we can look at what happened after the Civil War, we really should look at the Civil War a little bit here. Okay, Shirley? Yeah, and that's an interesting point too, because now the railroad was basically pretty much controlled by the North. Of course, you had the Transcontinental Railroad. They met out in Utah. They came from both directions. They met in Utah at starts with a P. Promontory or something like that. Promontory, Utah, something like that. Anyway, that's where the two railroads met, and then you had a railroad track across the whole country. The Indians looked at the engines and called it an iron horse, huffing and puffing and belching out smoke. Okay, so you had the whole continent. You had a railroad track going across. But by the time of the Civil War, 70% of the railroads were in the North, or controlled by the North. And as far as industrial strength, it was a 10-to-1 ratio. The North had 10 times the industrial output of the South. The South was basically textile, cotton. Still is. You go down south, there's all kinds of textile mills. And oil now, of course. But that wasn't, nobody needed oil back then. There weren't any cars. So oil was actually discovered at Titusville, Pennsylvania anyway. It wasn't discovered in Texas. It isn't really Texas tea, it's Pennsylvania tea. Okay. But anyway, what happened then is the issues began getting real hot regarding, it was all political, and a lot of people don't even realize why the Civil War was fought. Actually, it was discussed within the ranks of the Freemasons. Otto von Bismarck in Germany even wrote about the Civil War before it happened, saying that it was planned. The Civil War in the United States. Bismarck, of course, is the one who united all the states of Germany into a united Germany. But he was in on this whole planning thing because he was an Illuminist too. This is a government, a secret government, hidden behind the visible one. Oh, incidentally, I thought it was rather interesting. I don't know if you heard this, but I'll just interject this here. Last night on Peter Jennings, ABC News, he was interviewing a secretary who survived that blast down in Oklahoma City. And the secretary worked on the far south side of the building, which is the part that survived. And she was one of the survivors. She said it was very unusual. She said that morning, she said all the supervisors were gone. And she said it was like a morgue in there because the supervisors, all the big wheels, weren't in the building. All of them were gone. Now, Peter Jennings never questioned that. She didn't elaborate. She thought it was strange that they would all happen to be gone when the building exploded. Do you think they might have known something? Or was it a coincidence they were all gone? There was no convention or special meeting. They just weren't there. Nobody showed up. And the part of the building that took the real beating was where the Social Security and the daycare center and those sort of things were housed. The Secret Service and ATF were way to the south side of the building. So I think it's rather interesting. All I'm saying is there are activities going on behind the scenes that people don't, and they always did. This is nothing new. This goes back to the origin of our country. As I started to say earlier, the war was only supposed to last 90 days, the Civil War. In fact, the conscription, which was the draft, forcing soldiers to fight, they forced them, they said, you have to serve 90 days. After all, Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy, was only 90 miles from Washington, D.C. It shouldn't be that hard to march 90 miles and whomp them. And yet when the Union, in fact, when the war started in 1861, a lot of the people from Maryland, from this area near Washington, they went out in the Battle of Bull Run, I believe it was. They went out and took picnic lunches, and they sat there and they said, oh, it's going to be wonderful. We can watch the North whip the South today. They put down blankets in the ground. They're having a little picnic, and all of a sudden the Southern Army just ran roughshod over them. They all had to hightail it out because the South was winning all the battles. One of the reasons was the greatest general that ever lived in the United States up to that point, Robert E. Lee, who was educated at West Point and was from Virginia, was asked by President Lincoln to serve as commander-in-chief of the Northern Army. He said, no, my heart is in Virginia and in the South, and he headed up the Southern Confederate Army. And he just ran roughshod over them. And the Union was losing and losing and losing everywhere they went. They'd win an occasional skirmish, but basically they're losing all the big battles. And people began to get disillusioned. One of the reasons the Union was beaten so badly, though, is Lincoln would send all of his orders through Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War. Stanton would take the messages and change them any way he wanted to, or not deliver them at all. And Lincoln could never figure out. As a matter of fact, he said at one point, he said if, I believe it was General Meade, he said if Meade's not going to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a while. The things were so bad, everything he couldn't understand why great opportunities were missed. But Stanton later wrote in a book called Mr. Secretary, which has now been reprinted. It was out of print for a while. He wrote in a book that the reason he did this is he said he didn't want to beat the South, he wanted to destroy the South. He said in order to destroy any people with war, it takes 4 years. If you end the war before 4 years are up, you will not have devastated that people, you will not have demoralized them, bankrupted them enough. You have to totally obliterate them, and it takes 4 years. Now, isn't that interesting? That's an Illuministic doctrine, by the way. How long was World War I? 4 years. World War II, from the time the United States entered it, 4 years, right? Any of the big major campaigns were really 4 years. The Vietnamese War dragged out a little longer, but the bulk of it was 4 years, if you stop and think about it. And what they wanted to do is crush the South, have northern enterprising and entrepreneurs come in, buy up the places and build things there and then own them. In other words, the South would be owned by the North, northern business people. And Stanton made the statement, we will crush the South and they will not rise again as a people for 100 years. Now that was in 1865. 1965. If you stop and think about this now, the last of it was about finished up. Remember George, what was his name? George Wallace from Alabama? He was about the last to go down there. States' rights. He always talked about the sovereign state of Alabama. Finally somebody shot him. wouldn't let the blacks into the university or into these different public buildings. Actually stood in the doorway and said, "I'll not let a black come through here." Called out the National Guard of Alabama against the blacks. He said, "This is a sovereign state." States' rights. Still fighting the war 100 years later. But Stanton was right. You know, there was 100 years of devastation. Really, the people didn't rise. They began to grow again, but they never really started to come out of this whole thing until the 60s. And then you had all this revolution stuff and riots and so forth. Racial tension. So it's amazing what they can predict. Well, we didn't really, time's almost up, we didn't really get into the Civil War much, but we kind of got a little foundation laid for it. See, a number of things happened. There was, as I said, the social issue was slavery. The South said, we can't even exist unless we have these slaves. The North said, it's immoral. You're terrible people for having the slaves. And they said, well, it'll bankrupt us. Well, too bad. This was all engineered. Books were written. Lies were told on the South. Do you believe every person that lived in the South was that nasty? They're all just evil, rotten people that beat their slaves half to death? No. That was a lot of hype from the North up here, in order to stir up the frenzy and weld the people behind the cause of defeating the South so that the businessmen could move in. No. Biblically, slavery was not immoral. In fact, the Bible says in Paul's letter to Philemon, he said, serve your master. You know, Philemon was a Christian and so was his master. But he had a master, yeah. Slavery is not, it's not immoral. I have a book at home called In Defense of Virginia and the South. It'll give you a whole different perspective on it. Sure, it's immoral to break up families and beat people and keep them down that way. But the way slavery was run, in itself, intrinsically, no, it's not immoral. Well, some people sold themselves into slavery too. And some people sold themselves into slavery in order to get over to the United States. They sell themselves for a period of 5 years or 10 years or whatever. Indentured slaves, yes, Well, see, there was a lot of confusion because the blacks in the South, a lot of them thought the Northerners love us because they made all this happen. They gave us our great Jubilee. A lot of them went north. They went north into the cities, Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, all these different places. And when they got there, they found out the Northerns were so prejudiced they couldn't stand them. In the South, they had it much better. In fact, you will find, history bears this out. You can look in the books and you'll see this. The majority of the blacks that went north went back to the South. And it wasn't because of the weather. It's because they were used to of course, their little thing was gone then too, because they had it so good before. They had a place to live. They had food to eat. I mean, the plantation owners basically, by and large, took very good care of them and gave them a lot of freedom and latitude. They just didn't give them a check. They only had to work 2 months out of the year, so they didn't give them a check, but they gave them a place to live and food and everything. They could use their land. They could hunt. They could fish. They were happy, with the exception of a few. But that's not the impression you get from the books, is it? Every one of them was beaten with whips. They all had scars. We're going to really get into this next time, but what I'm going to do, since this is set up, I'm going to take just 2 or 3 minutes. I want to show you some pictures of what we'll be talking about next time somewhat. See, I don't know exactly how far we're ever going to get. We only have 4 more sessions, and I'm going to do my best to really cram everything into it I can. Somebody can tell me who this is, and if you don't know, I don't know what to think of you. Okay, who is this? Jane? Abraham Lincoln. Okay. And does anybody know which president he was? The 16th. Very good. Okay. Abraham Lincoln was not totally opposed to slavery. He was opposed to having two nations. He made a speech one time called I would save the Union. He said, if it's all slave, so be it. If it's all free, so be it. But I will save the Union. That's what he wanted to do. And he was on the slavery issue. It gained him a lot of support. So he did hit on that issue. As a matter of fact, when he was debating Stephen Douglas one time, he stood up and he made the statement that while volumes have been written on how slavery is a good thing, and he looked out at a lot of these white people, he said, I've never yet met the man who is willing to take the good of it by becoming a slave himself. Okay? In other words, so if it's such a good thing, do we have any volunteers here? Do you have a comment, Jane? The best one? Boy. Probably would have to say Abraham Lincoln. I mean, if you add everything up, probably so. I mean, they all had their problems. But anyway, so that was his, part of his platform was slavery. But it was basically save the Union. You know, we don't want this country split up. He knew what it meant. He knew who was behind it. And later on, he paid for it with a bullet. But he was known for his wit, for his humor. Everybody loved to hear what he had to say because he'd come out with the strangest things. He'd get into the courtrooms, you know, and even the judges would burst out laughing. They always say sober as a judge, but he'd get the judge laughing. Everybody just loved to have him around because of that. But he was, in one instance, he was debating. This is when he was running for Senate or for Congress. I think it was either representative or senator. I can't remember now. But he was debating with Peter Cartwright. Peter Cartwright was an evangelist, a firebrand preacher. And of course, Lincoln couldn't imagine why a preacher would want to stoop so low as to run for a governmental office. Peter Cartwright was debating with Lincoln, and Cartwright started in preaching to the audience. I was out in one of these brush arbors, you know. They're outside. Cartwright was a fire eater. I mean, he really would let them have it. So Cartwright stood up and during the debate and started preaching, and then he said, all who wish to go to heaven will please stand. And everybody stood up and Lincoln sat down. He was sitting there. And he said, all who wish to go to heaven will please stand. Everybody was standing and Lincoln just sat there. Now remember, both of them were running for Congress, right? So he said he thought he was really going to get Lincoln, make him look like a monkey. He said, Mr. Lincoln, where exactly do you intend to go? He said, if it's all the same to you, I'm going to Congress. In other words, Congress is hell. That's what he was saying. Cartwright, why do you want to go there? You know? So, in other words, Congress is not heaven, Mr. Cartwright. I don't know why you want to go there. So he had a way with words. He was an excellent attorney, and he was known for not taking much money for it and taking no credit for anything. He had gotten people off the hook many, many times, people who were innocently charged. In one instance, he was cross-examining a man named John Cass in the courtroom, and John Cass was lying. He knew he was lying. In fact, this was a murder case, and he himself had pinned the rap on this other guy, and he said that he could see what really happened because of the full moon that was out. Well, Lincoln had an almanac, and there was the moon was not full that night. In fact, the moon had already set by the time that this crime was committed. So he was asking him questions. He said, now, your name, sir, is John Cass. Is that right? He said, that's right. And he said, now, people named John sometimes are known as Jack. Does anyone ever call you Jackass? And the judge started rolling, you know. He'd do things like that. This is a little example of how he worked in court. But one of the things that brought Lincoln to prominence as a lawyer was the Cyrus McCormick case. Cyrus McCormick invented the Reaper, McCormick Reaper. And there was a lawsuit regarding the patent. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And McCormick knew Lincoln from Illinois when he was at New Salem. And he picked Lincoln to be one of his attorneys. First he had picked Edwin M. Stanton, another prominent attorney. Stanton standing there, and another attorney, and Stanton said to McCormick, "I absolutely refuse to appear in front of the Supreme Court with this scarecrow." He said, "It would embarrass me too much." And Lincoln was standing right there. So McCormick said, "I insist that he be on this case." So Lincoln said, "That's okay. What I'll do is I will stay in the office. I won't even go into the courtroom, but I'll do all the work. I'll prepare the case. I'll do all the research, prepare it all." So he did all this research, prepared the whole case, and all Stanton did was study it over and read it off. And McCormick won the case in the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice and the others in the Supreme Court, everybody commented to Stanton what a wonderful job he had done. Nobody knew Lincoln had done it. And when Lincoln was there at the end of the case, he never took credit for it. He let Stanton take all the credit, get all the pats on the back. And Stanton wrote in his autobiography how he said, "I hate Lincoln and I love him at the same time. He's everything that I've always wanted to be and couldn't be." And he commented, he never forgot it. He said, "I can't understand how anybody could do all that work and take no credit for it." It just almost drove him out of his mind. He just couldn't believe anybody could do that. So, this is the man who wanted to save the Union. Now, like I say, I'm just very short on time. I don't have time to explain all of this, but we'll go into it more next week. Here are some of the, here's a picture of Edwin Stanton over here. Colonel Lafayette Baker, who was another man that was in on the assassination. Major Thomas Eckert, and Charles A. Dana. These were all part of the War Department or part of the war effort, and it's supposed to be Lincoln's friends, members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. But they engineered the assassination of Lincoln, and they sabotaged the war for a great part of it. I'll cover this a little more next time. I just want to briefly show you a couple of these pictures so you can see who I'm talking about. Jefferson Davis, of course, was the president of the Confederacy. He was inaugurated before Lincoln was inaugurated. And who knows what state in the South seceded first? Who led the way? It's real easy if you think about it. Where was the first battle fought? What fort was attacked? Fort Sumter, South Carolina. South Carolina led the way. They voted first to secede, and they also had the first battle. Now, Davis was the president. Judah P. Benjamin, who was a Jew, okay? Judah P. Benjamin held every post in the Confederate cabinet at one time or another. He was the brains behind the whole operation and the assassination of Lincoln. And when he finished, after the war, by the way, he went to England and he was the privy counselor of the Queen. Okay? Jacob Thompson, Beverly Tucker, these are both Confederate cabinet members. On this side you have Edwin Stanton, Senator Zachariah Chandler, Senator Benjamin Wade, and Senator John Conness. Now John Conness was Mr. California. He basically controlled California. Wade and Chandler were called radical Republicans. Wade was from Ohio, and they were extremists and wanting to destroy and obliterate the South. And as I said, this is just a preview. Would you pick that up for me, Sam? Thanks. Okay. And lastly, and then we're going to have to stop, here are three of the men that assisted in the assassination. All they did really was Henry Johnson over there, way to the right, all he did was have a wagon ready, and he didn't even know why, but they pinned the thing on him. David Harold was actually hung for it because he was considered a co-conspirator. These are the men that took the rap that really didn't do that much. They were the cannon fodder, so to speak. But to top it all off, John Wilkes Booth, who was said to make the women swoon, this man right here, he was considered to be the most handsome actor, the most handsome man in the world at the time. Everybody just went crazy, goo goo gaga over John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. He was also an officer in the Confederate Army and a blockade runner. When the war was over, or about to end, he was the one who, with a Derringer, went into Ford's Theater, went up into the presidential box, and it was arranged for him to be able to do that. The guard had left. That was all organized that way. Went in and shot Lincoln through the back of the head. Now, Booth jumped off the balcony of the box, caught his leg on a flag, and fell to the floor off balance, and he broke his leg. As he was jumping, he yelled out in Latin, "Sic semper tyrannis." Does anybody think they know what that means? Sic semper tyrannis. We know semper means always. Like semper fidelis is always faithful. Yeah. Such always to tyrants. Sic semper tyrannis. So he thought Lincoln was a tyrant. Okay? Now, he got away. And in fact, he really got away. There was a manhunt out for him later, and they said they cornered him in a barn. They shot and killed him. And then there was a man named Boston Corbett who collected the reward for it, a sergeant in the Union Army. But strangely enough, the man that they really killed was James William Boyd. Notice the same initials? JWB. Even a similarity in appearance. This man was a Confederate officer. He had a broken leg also from being in the war. And when the people in the theater saw that it was the left leg of Booth that was caught, this man's right leg was broken. But that's all right. They had a body. It was good enough. John Wilkes Booth lived an additional 20 years and died in Ceylon. I'll give you more details on some of this next time. Any final questions? We really have gone over here. It's hard to quit sometimes. Okay? No questions, comments? Once we get past the Civil War, we're going to get into some of these other things that happened in our century. We're going to talk about some of those inventions, too. In fact, let's have an assignment here. I want every student to list, and you probably will have duplications, but that's okay, to list 10 things that were invented between 1850 and 1900. Huh? Make it more than 10? Don't you just love your mother? All right, make it 25. Okay? I want to list the 25 inventions and who invented them. And I want the year. It's getting better all the time, isn't it? The inventor and what it was and what it did. Just write it all down for me. You will be graded on that. Oh, sure, you can do a character sketch on each inventor if you want to. But put down what country he was from, too, if you can find it. Okay, we will pray, and then you can complain later. All right? Father in heaven, we do thank Thee for this opportunity and for what we've been able to study. And I just pray now that Thou wouldst be with us and help us as we depart. Help us to try to retain what we've learned and that somehow we can use this for Thy glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.